Our guest today is going to discuss a topic that will definitely expand your mind. Amelia Cohen-Levy is a communications specialist at the National Geospatial-Intelligence Agency. She's also served as a technical writer, translating, in her words, geek into English, and as an editor of an analytic intelligence product. She's also earned her Master of Fine Arts in Poetry from American University, and she's here to talk about the intersections between poetry and analytic intelligence. The fact that April is National Poetry Month, and Amelia is my favorite subject matter expert on the topic, should provide for a lively discussion on how leadership, poetry, and analysis all converge into one great discussion. Warning, in this episode I will read the poem The Hurt Locker, which contains both adult themes and languages. Please take into consideration that some of the language used may evince painful or offensive imagery or emotions. Now, let's speak with Amelia. So, Amelia, great to have you on Candid Leadership. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Well, we want to talk today about poetry, analysis, and leadership. And the question is, how do we unpackage that? How do we start down this road?
So there are a couple of different ways that we can start down this road, but I think the easiest way to begin is to give you a quote from subject matter expert, right? So let's start off there. At the 2017 Caleres Conference that was held at Georgetown University, Bruce Rydell, who's a senior fellow and director of the Brookings Intelligence Project, with 30 years of intelligence experience at the CIA, echoed this idea. He said, "A very good Israeli friend of mine once said to me, the art of intelligence is not a science, it's poetry. And it's very hard to find poets these days."
Yes, I'm thinking especially in National Capital Region, poetry on a CV or resume or on USA Jobs, probably slim to none. Is that what I'm getting from this?
Definitely slim to none on USA Jobs. There's actually a really vibrant community of poets in the National Capital Region. A lot of the schools out here offer the Masters in Fine Arts and Poetry. So there's a really vibrant community of poets, but they don't often intersect with some of the other things that happen in the National Capital Region, like, all of the government stuff, right? So the intersection doesn't happen as often as would be ideal.
But you have the background in this, and that's what I find fascinating. And how have you seen some of your leaders work to kind of foster this creative thought?
So this is something that former NGA director Robert Cardillo used to say as well, that intelligence is both an art and a science. And he used to also say, we need more poets. For me, the science part is pretty obvious, but the art part of intelligence being an art can be rather subjective, as all art is, right?
Right, absolutely. And so let's go back to your bio. You spoke about working at NGA. How did a person with Master of Fine Arts walk into that field?
Well, to say that I walked into that field is definitely an understatement. The short version is that I lost a bet. I'd been having a conversation with somebody who said, I think the intelligence community would really benefit from your skill set, from the way you look at the world, from the way you understand things. I think you should try and join this community. And I said, there's no way they'd hire me. Like, I'm a poet. I, studied in Berkeley in my undergrad. There's no way. Well, I got hired, so I lost the bet. And here we go from there. So that's the short version. The longer version is that the IC and DoD really benefits from thought diversity and from a fair dose of disruption. That disruption is really useful in terms of challenging the way people think, getting people to explore all different sides of an issue. And that's what I bring to the table. So while my skill sets align to multiple roles as an analytic product editor, as a communication specialist, and as an editor, and if I wanted to go down that road, I probably could be an analyst. But when it comes to the poetry part of it, poetry is basically just a different kind of puzzle. Some people explore equations or code or imagery to find the pieces and put them together into a story. I'm used to looking at words and finding out what their story really is. So asking questions like, why is that comma there? What is that word choice about? What are the hidden layers of meaning here? And it's the same basic skill set as an analyst, just applied in a different form.
That part of understanding the point of a comma, a word choice, I mean, that is fascinating in the fact that from the lens of a poet, you can see application in a different method, in a different measure. And when you go back to analysts, showing and demonstrating the ability to kind of empathize with what they're trying to grapple with, what they're doing, how do you use poetry with respect to tying that into almost like an analytical view or vision of empathy?
So I think the empathy piece here is really important. Poetry is often used to communicate double meanings, deep feelings, or to honor important moments. And these are things, especially when we're in ICDOD, when we're talking about intelligence products, we can't necessarily share all of the things that we do unless we're within our community. So being able to tell those stories is very important. When we look at poetry particularly, American culture doesn't value poetry in the same way that other cultures do. But poetry is worth being analyzed because it has inherent value to intelligence. Poetry also gives us ways that we can learn more about cultural perspectives from different parts of the world through their poetry.
No, I think that is pretty fascinating. And you've also spoken with me in the past about some of the writing out there to kind of challenge the intelligence community and how we view things right now. What are some of those things that you've read recently that you'd like to highlight?
So there are a few things that I've read recently. One of them is this piece by Zachary Tyson Brown, and he wrote, it's called How to Write Like an Intelligence Analyst, and he discusses the format of the inverted pyramid. And this format directly ties to my theory that the perfect poetic form for intelligence writing is the sonnet. So here's why. A little bit about the sonnet. The sonnet is a finite format. It's designed to be contained or in a box or compartmentalized, if you will. It's only 14 lines, so it's limited in space, but within that space, it gives the room to explore a very specific idea and then turn that idea around on its head. So that's known as a volta. It's a dance term. And that maps directly to this idea of the inverted pyramid, because depending upon what kind of sonnet you choose, like if it's Petrarchan or Spenserian or Shakespearean or what have you, you can use the sonnet to mirror this inverted pyramid format where you put the bottom line up front and then you go on to prove your case. And then you have a chance to kind of turn things on their ear a little bit and explore that different perspective.
So as you're exploring that, let's kind of dive into, I think we've talked in the past about ethos, logos, and pathos. Like, how do you see that combination working together to create meaningful impact?
This is the other thing about a sonnet that gives you the space to combine that ethos, logos, and pathos. But it's also important to understand what those terms mean and why those are really valuable when it comes to intelligence writing. In order to create that successful intelligence product that has meaningful impact, you want to incorporate those three elements. And yes, ancient Greece and what have you, but they're relevant today. The ethos is your credibility. So it's the seal of your organization that represents your connection to the mission. And it's the thing that says, my work is representative of the appropriate level of subject matter expertise. So your ethos is it's your bona fides. It's your way of saying, I've got the street cred. You can trust what I'm saying. The logos is the critical thinking and analytic research that goes into crafting your judgment. So it represents all of the time that an analyst spends looking at an issue, exploring it, understanding it, bringing in all those pieces together, and then making it make sense. Now, going back to the sonnet for a second, when we talked about that volta, the place where you get to kind of turn away from the immediate subject at hand and take a different approach to it, that sonnet's volta can also be used to propose a secondary thought. So maybe that's a potential follow-on idea or a next step for the analytic research, or maybe it's a space to add in the pathos, that emotional perspective. And pathos is so important because it really can help the reader emotionally connect to the impact of the writing. While much of the poetry that we read and that we've experienced in our lives is all about pathos, right? Like the confessional style of, I'm in love, I got hurt, here's my experience, here are the things that I'm thinking. It's hugely emotional, which can make it hard to read. Not enough intelligence analysis is. We don't often honor the importance of emotion in intelligence analysis. And there's an apocryphal story that's one of my favorites about how a decision maker was doing some reading before going on an official visit. He read the facts, he read the analysis, the logos. He understood what was happening in the region. But the analyst who was preparing this for him added one key line of pathos that made all the difference. And the line was something like, "They do not have time to bury their dead." That hit the decision maker on another level. And it was that level of emotion and gave that decision maker a completely new way of understanding what was happening on the ground. Since humans relate to other humans through emotions primarily, it makes complete sense that that would help a reader see things in a new way.
Absolutely. And it would help the reader and the decision maker. I mean, the impact of not having enough time to bury their dead, that it just jumps out. It would jump out on the paper, and also when spoken, in the way that you inflect and really put an exclamation point on that context is important. Now, let's talk about the impact of poetry a little bit, and let's dive into that. When you've traveled, where have you seen the impact of poetry, vice what you've spoken about already in our kind of American view? How do you see that in other areas of the world?
Poetry is viewed so differently in cultures all across the world. We know that once humans figured out how to do that whole talking thing, they started creating poetry. I mean, that goes back to the oral tradition. That goes back to, Homer, right? Creating the Iliad and the Odyssey. That goes back to Babylonian times, creating Gilgamesh. This was a way that we captured our oral tradition and made it interesting. We did it through the form of poetry. When I've traveled or when I've explored other cultures, there are lots of different ways that this stands out. One of my favorite stories is when I traveled in Israel, I met a cab driver named Moshe. And we all know that cab drivers have this special kind of wisdom, right? So Moshe explained that the English translation of the biblical Psalm 23, which is one of our most ancient poems that is still read today. So people still read this poem thousands of years after it was written. And Moshe's theory is that the translation that we read today is inaccurate. It's just wrong. So Moshe would say it's not meant to be the paths of righteousness, which is, path. You can go one of two directions on a path, right? That's it. Those are your choices. Moshe said that it's not supposed to be paths of righteousness. Rather, it's supposed to be circles of justice. I've looked into his translation. I don't fully agree with his translation, but I love this interpretation. The idea that you have to look at all sides of a problem, walk in complete circles around it before you can completely appreciate what you're really seeing.
That is so true in leadership. Absolutely. Because your view from where you sit at the table in every angle is important.
I mean, when it comes to leadership, that's hugely important. That's the understanding, not just what that individual does for their job. It's what they want for their job, their hopes, their dreams, their career path, their life outside of work. It's all of those things. And it's having that empathy for that, acknowledging that while as a leader, you may be looking at the check boxes of what do I need to fill this billet? What are the skill sets? You're actually dealing with a human who has very human needs and who has very human wants and desires. And when you're able to be empathetic to that, you're really able to see the whole person. And since we know that everyone in the ICDOD, especially these days and beyond, is talking about how do we bring our whole selves to work and how do we honor our whole selves at work, step one is empathy. It's recognizing that we're dealing with a whole human being and not just a list of skills.
And also how to get the best of that person at work. And I think that's ultimately, what you've spoken about with poetry and analysis, kind of bringing those things together and displaying it in a way that we get to a better conclusion.
I don't even think of it as a better conclusion, though I believe it's a better conclusion personally, but it's a more holistic conclusion. It's a more honest conclusion. One of the things that it's very easy for us to forget when we're doing our analysis is that we're humans talking about other humans, talking about other human issues all across the world. And so when we're looking at those human issues from an analytic perspective, we have to shut some parts of our brain down. We have to use our training and our skills. We have to be very objective, like the logos is in high gear. And we forget that pathos. We forget that we're talking about other humans. We forget that we're talking about people who have hopes and dreams and lives that are so different from our own. And that is in no way to justify the actions or decisions or behavior of our adversaries, but it's definitely something we have to keep in mind, especially, when we're looking at our adversaries, because it helps us understand them better, but also when we're looking at the folks who aren't our adversaries, the folks who are impacted by these actions and these decisions every day.
Absolutely. And that ties into a reading that I think you can't have an episode on poetry without reading some poetry. So we're going to go down that road now. I'd really like to read The Hurt Locker by Brian Turner. It's from the book Here, Bullet. It is copyrighted in 2005, but I think it's emblematic of when we talk about poetry and the ability to strike at the heart of meaning. And the poem goes like this: The Hurt Locker by Brian Turner. Nothing but hurt left here. Nothing but bullets and pain and the bled out slumping and all the fucks and goddams and Jesus Christ of the wounded. Nothing left here but the hurt. Believe it when you see it. Believe it when a 12-year-old rolls a grenade into the room, or when a sniper punches a hole deep into someone's skull. Believe it when 4 men step from a cab in Mosul to shower the streets in brass and fire. Open the hurt locker and see what there is of knives and teeth. Open the hurt locker and learn how rough men come hunting for souls. Now that's a poem. And that poem has been monumental and influential in so many different ways. How, as someone who reads poetry and talks about poetry and has opened my eyes to poetry, how do you see that, Amelia? What's the impact of a poem like that?
I mean, first of all, I'm just taking a breath. The impact of a poem like that, just when you first read it, when you first hear it, it's a gut punch. It's designed to be a gut punch with the way the phrasing is happening, with the repetition, with the way the lines are broken, with the word choices. We're starting off with some very heavy words. And I'm not necessarily talking, the not suitable for work words. I'm talking about hurt, pain, bled out slumping. Those are the kinds of words that really get to you in that emotional way, and they're designed to. They were chosen to do so. Someone spent time thinking about what word do I want here and how am I going to get the maximum impact? And they chose those words. So the selection, right, goes back to that conversation of word choice, the selection of those words to get that maximum impact, to get that gut punch, to get you there and in that space. And when we're talking about hurt, when we're talking about these feelings, more to the point of the poem, when we're talking about the experience of somebody who's served our nation, boots on the ground, doing things, we're getting a view into that internal monologue. We're getting a view into the inside of a person's head. And that's something that has to be locked away, right? So that's why it's the locker. We have to lock it away. We have to put it to the side because you can't be thinking these things when you're in the middle of an exercise, when you're in the middle of an op. You can't. That's how people get hurt. That's how people get killed. You have to push the emotion away and focus on the task at hand. And that leaves this space for later on. You unlock things, you open up this locker, and all of these feelings come tumbling out. And that's where we get into this idea of owning and processing the experiences that people have had and the moral injury that happens, the damage that is done to our psyche, whether it's somebody who has served on front lines, tip of the spear, or somebody who has had to do the analysis, see the different things, see it from the very, 10,000 foot perspective. It still hurts us. It still has an impact on our emotions, on our feelings, on our experiences. We still carry that. And those stories are so important. And the damage that it does to people, PTSD, full stop. That is because you have to find a way to look at your experiences and the emotions that you had during that experience and resolve them and bring them together as one piece. You're breaking down those compartments and you're putting them together. And that is a huge and heavy lift. And I can't stress the importance enough for anyone who's experienced any kind of trauma to get the support that they need, because this is a huge thing for any person to do. And that's where we come to the end of the poem. Open the hurt locker and learn how rough men come hunting for souls. When we think of the people that we know who have served, the men and women of our military, they have to be rough in order to survive. But they're not rough people. They're humans, just like us, the hopes, the dreams, the families, the desires. And this idea that they're going hunting for souls, maybe that's what they have to think in the moment. But when they come home, when they have time to process their experiences, the poet is telling us very clearly, this is who I have to be in order to survive. But that doesn't necessarily mean it's who they are. So it goes back to this idea of having empathy for the whole person, for the moral injury that they have experienced, for the damage that may have been done to them, or the things they may have felt, and giving them the space to own and process that in their lives.
That is so true. And that space is so incredibly important. For my listeners, if you're suffering from PTSD or you know someone who is, please reach out to the Post-Traumatic Stress Disorder Foundation of America Veterans Line at 1-877-717-PTSD. Again, the number is 1-877-717-7837. They're there to provide referrals, information, and resources to help veterans and their families. Thank you, Amelia, for going down this road with me today and to discuss poetry and really its criticality into how we see, visualize, and see how the world impacts us all around.
It's my pleasure. Ultimately, I believe that this is what poetry can give to analysis. It's a way to combine multiple trains of thought into one succinct piece of writing. And I'm not saying that all intelligence writing in the future should be written in iambic pentameter, though I am willing to bake cookies for the first person to get a sonnet into the president's daily brief. Offer stands.
That's nice. That is quite the challenge. And if any of the listeners know that this has happened, we look forward to hearing about that.
What it comes down to when we're looking at poetry and how it influences and connects to analysis, the way poets think about their words and about the puzzles within their words have lessons that we all can use. And so let's use those lessons.
Well, bravo. Thank you so much for being my guest today on Candid Leadership. That was Amelia Cohen-Levy. If you want to learn more about her great work, please see LinkedIn. I really appreciate you listening to this conversation. And if you want more candid perspectives on leadership, go to colonelcandid.com. There, you'll find articles, podcasts, and resources for your leadership journey. I would also encourage you to share this podcast with your friends, colleagues, and whoever you think could benefit from the information and wisdom shared by my amazing guests. I know I grow with every conversation, and I want to share that experience with as many leaders as I can. This show grows by word of mouth, so be sure to share this podcast. And if you think I earned it, leave me a 5-star review. Thanks for listening. I'm Colonel Candace Frost.